Many thinkers have spent an enormous amount of time trying to be the first ones to correctly pinpoint the societal conflicts of today and the next 50 years or so. Some have asserted that it will be cities who will increasingly resemble the city-states of the ancient world versus the rural areas who will mostly remain the same as they were at the end of the 20th century. Such developments, the hypothesis goes, will necessarily lead to political conflicts and the fundamental conflict of visions, not just because of the difference in economic development, but also because of the difference in the environment. The epitome of such thinking can be found in the argument that the controversy over the Second Amendment can be better addressed by localism, as rural areas clearly want and need more guns than highly crowded urban ones. Now, such rationale definitely has a point. Others have asserted that the conflict will be between the so-called haves and the so-called have-nots, which is really just a postmodern rehashing of the old Marxist claptrap. And while the resentment and envy can, for sure, be weaponized, in the end this conflict rarely plays out in public policy and has rarely been playing out naturally without, well, let's say forced intervention via, let's say, Soviet tanks. But when it does, it's usually in a very diluted form and certainly not the decisive factor as the fans of this hypothesis would want everyone to believe. And finally, the third popular hypothesis goes along the lines of tradition versus progress, or religion versus secularism. The adherents of this idea also do have a point, sort of. Now, while philosophically we could make a 3-hour-long video for each of these three, from a practical politics perspective, we do need a unifying narrative for all three that includes as many nuances as possible, allows for exceptions to the norm, can reasonably predict future positions, and allows for easy-to-understand frameworks through which we can promote policy. So, let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alrighty, so in this video the aim is to do basically two things. One, to name the issue and describe it better than it currently is, and two, to put it in a practical politics framework. Now for the newer subscribers, what I mean by put it in a practical or into a practical politics framework is basically how to use this when you're having discussions in which your goal is to further a non-leftist narrative or a non-leftist policy. Although there are only two things we need to talk about, this could get pretty long, so let us begin. Alright. So, first of all, I need to thank the leftist-leaning journalist, British journalist, David Goodhart, for coming up with the terminology in his book The Road to Somewhere, The Populist Revolt and the Future of Politics. But while I'll borrow a bit from his, or a bit of his terminology, what I'm about to say is more generalized than his book, which is quite entertaining. By the way, you should read it. But in The Road to Somewhere, Goodhart is almost exclusively focused on Brexit and the United Kingdom, with some less than fortunate parallels with the United States. Now, I'm not saying I necessarily know better, but I'm saying that here in this video we'll be going at the issue in a more generalized fashion because we aim to describe a phenomenon that can be observed almost everywhere on the planet. So, the current policy and generally political conflict of visions is between anywheres and somewheres. So who are these people and how do we recognize them and how do we differentiate them? Well, it's really not that hard. And anywhere is someone who is perfectly comfortable in living and working, well, almost anywhere. That's why they're called anywheres. Such people don't care that much whether they live and work in London, Singapore, Cairo, Washington DC, Buenos Aires, Lusaka, or Bangkok. As a result, they tend to have very little or no loyalty to their communities, their nations, or their religion, and routinely tend to find these things a hindrance rather than something to be cherished, nurtured, and protected. Many words have been used to describe such people, and not always very pleasant ones, such as globalists, elitists, cosmopolitan, or ruthless. But anywheres is a much better description because it is a description based on lifestyle rather than ideology. And descriptions based on lifestyle are inherently superior because people can lie about their ideas, but lifestyle is an observable fact. So how do we recognize an anywhere? Well, there are a few common threads. Now, contrary to Goodhart's description, anywheres are not usually better educated. In fact, as it is obvious for most people, anywheres tend to be pretty dumb, precisely because the anywhere lifestyle implies a high degree of shallowness. The anywheres are, however, very well credentialed. Although not a prerequisite, shiny credentials are usually the gateway to becoming an anywhere. A degree at Harvard, even in something as disdainful as gender studies with a minor in Madonna studies, and yes, that's a real thing at Harvard, that still opens quite a lot of doors in many places in the world. The shiny Harvard logo on the diploma is enough to do that. For now, at least. In addition to being credentialed, but again not necessarily better educated, the anywheres also tend to have or successfully pretend to have or show relevant papers of skills that are not geographically dependent, such as international business, IT, banking consultants, and so on and so forth. And finally, the anywheres tend to be in the global top 1% in terms of income. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're necessarily rich by European or North American standards. All it takes to get into the global top 1% is to make more than $32,000 per year before taxes, or almost 29,000 euros per year before taxes. Roughly 20 million Americans qualify for the global top 1%, for instance. Now, that doesn't mean you need to be in the global top 1% in terms of income to be an anywhere. It's enough if you're in the top 1% of your region. For instance, in India, being in the top 1%, you need to make 600,000 rupees, or 6 lakhs, as they call it, per year before taxes. Now, that is only $8,600 US dollars. That's where one should look up the anywheres. The reverse is also true. You don't have to be an anywhere if you're in the global or local top 1%. Many affluent farmers, for instance, are definitely not anywheres, even though they sure do make more than 30,000 US dollars per year. I'm mentioning all of this just to emphasize that these criteria on how to recognize an anywhere need to be taken together rather than as individual absolutes. Also, there are degrees for each of them as well. Another common characteristic of anywheres is a high degree of urbanization in their lifestyle. Now, what I mean by urbanization is that these people are significantly reliant and, dare I say, addicted on things that normal people are not, such as smartphones, Wi-Fi, social media, Uber, delivery food, card payments, and so on and so forth. Such behaviors are usually, though again not always, good predictors of people who would die among the first should a civilizational collapse occur, like it is happening these days in Venezuela with the prolonged power outage, for instance. I will come back to this because this aspect is perhaps the most relevant in differentiating between anywheres and somewheres. So, what are the somewheres then? Well, the more poetic version to define the somewheres is that they are the people who come from somewhere, live somewhere, and tend to stay there. Whether that somewhere is Bournemouth, Székesfehérvár-on-Sea, Salzburg, Meissen, Gori, Uzhgorod, or Szigetu-Marmacy. These people tend to be thoroughly reliant on the success of their immediate communities. They tend to work for the local employers, rarely change jobs, rarely claim a career for themselves, and tend to be culturally conservative and oftentimes economically conservative as well. They tend to place a high level of trust in the local institutions, such as the local church or the local school, and be skeptical of overreaching institutions such as the remote national or federal government or supranational institutions such as the European Union or the United Nations. Now, just living in a smaller city or a town does not necessarily make one somewhere. As I said, there are degrees, but it is a good indicator. But there are somewheres in big cities too, especially in Europe. Those tend to be the descendants of the old aristocratic families who inherited properties in the old town and who still live at the same address as their great-great-grandparents. Alongside the well-off farmers, these are also the somewheres who are pretty rich. In many ways, Donald Trump is a somewhere too, as he identifies most of his life work with New York. But as I said, there are degrees to this. Barack Obama also identified with Chicago in many ways, but he's more of an anywhere than Donald Trump is. Now, how do you differentiate in the field between an anywhere and a somewhere? Now, in my experience, the best way to differentiate, especially if you don't know the credentials, the professions, or much about the person, is by looking at the individual's support for or practice of expressive individualism. Now, this is a new term. What is expressive individualism? Now, the notion of expressive individualism is now mostly discussed in religious circles, particularly Catholic circles, which makes sense because the Church in general and the Catholic Church in particular have been the most affected by it. But the concept is a bit older, and the religious scholars picked it up from a very fine book which I recommend you read, and the book is called Habits of the Heart, Individualism and Commitment in American Life by a chap named Robert Bellah, published in 1985. The shortest definition of expressive individualism that I can give is basically like this: individuals for whom any external authority is inherently haram, and all internal authority is to be lauded, appreciated, and amplified in the name of and as a sign of authenticity. So, for instance, if you tell a person that they're not going to revolutionize society and that there are civilizational structures in place that take time to change and that maybe they don't have to be changed, if that individual reacts with rage rather than introspection, that individual manifests expressive individualism and is likely an anywhere. Now, mind you, not all forms of expressive individualism are bad, and not all forms of it make one necessarily an anywhere. But the more profound one's rejection of external source of morality, and by external I mean other than himself, the more profound that rejection is, the more likely it is you're dealing with an anywhere. So, for instance, one rejecting the religious teaching of his family does not necessarily make that one individual an anywhere, but one rejecting the unequivocal historical evidence of, let's say, straight family being by far the best, that one is almost guaranteed to be an anywhere. Because such line of thinking, namely to assume that you are the specialist snowflake that ever snowflaked to know better than 10,000 years of history, that line of thinking usually manifests in most other areas as well. And while I'm sure they do exist, I have yet to meet people who engage in such extreme versions of expressive individualism who are not anywheres or mentally deranged. I'm sure such exceptions do exist, there's always degrees on everything, but as I said, I have yet to meet or read about such people. So, why is this important? Well, because anywheres tend to hold politically extreme positions in higher numbers than both somewheres, and the people who are in between these two positions. David Goodhart, the journalist from whom I borrowed the terminology, estimated that about 50% of the British public are somewheres, about 20 to 25% are anywheres, and the rest are somewhere in between. But these percentages vary quite a lot by region. In the intermarium, as much as 75% of the public is solidly somewhere, no more than 10% is anywhere, and the rest are in between. The common thread, however, is that there is no country on Earth where the anywheres are in the majority. In fact, I would go as far as to argue that the United Kingdom and to a certain extent the United States are the global exceptions, in the sense that in these places the anywheres are at least a significant minority. On most of the planet, including most of Europe, the anywheres are a tiny, marginal minority, albeit very, very vocal. And this is the second reason why this is important. The anywheres, by virtue of their lifestyle, tend to be overrepresented in academia, government, the media, and other institutions with disproportionate influence on policy and society at large. Now, you have to understand, most people are not deep political thinkers. They're just not. And that's not their fault. Politics is difficult. So in most cases, people make up their mind judging first by their own immediate experience, and if that's not possible, then judging by what someone they trust tends to say. And this is where the media is losing, because the cathedral media assumes the order is the other way around. Media first, personal experience second. Anyway, the point is that most people, whether they're somewheres or anywheres or in between, these people make up their mind on most issues judging by personal experience first. And in the personal experience is primarily shaped by lifestyle. Hence, why this distinction between somewheres and anywheres is relevant, because it's easy to be an open borders type if your job and your lifestyle involves a lot of traveling. To you, the passport and the customs control are a nuisance, and you'd be very much love to get rid of that. Most people, including most anywheres, don't spend the time to think more profoundly about why the borders are there to begin with. Why did virtually every civilization end up coming with the borders, regardless of era, technology available, or culture? Or if they do think about that, expressive individualism comes into play and conclude that those people were or must have been just dumb, or racist, or bigots, or whatever phobes, and you simply know better because you're so smart and educated. Sounds silly, but this is really, quite literally, the thought process by which most people justify to themselves a militant pro-open borders position, especially here in Europe, though such lines of thought can be heard quite a lot in North America and some portions of Asia as well. Same goes with other issues too, especially the more extreme ones. Trans privileges is one such example. For starters, anywheres are a lot more likely to even know a transgender to begin with. As such, a lifestyle can only be fully possible in the big cities, where not only the facilities needed are much more readily available, but one can also lose oneself in the crowd pretty easy as well. Now combine that with the fact that anywheres, by virtue of their lifestyle, also tend to be more libertine, and that's how you get most anywheres agreeing by default with the most extremist demands of the LGBTist lobby. So that's the third reason why this is important. While most people are not deep political thinkers, the way they come up with ideas and opinions about policy is significantly influenced by whether they are anywheres or somewheres. Now, it should be noted that what I just said so far is a guideline. It applies in most circumstances, most of the time, on most of the issues, but it is not an absolute pronouncement. For instance, I myself qualify mostly as an anywhere. I have a liberal profession, I'm not well credentialed, but have a ton of relevant experience, which outpaces most credentials. I speak a crap ton of languages, and my lifestyle is travel-oriented. In fact, rarely 2 months go by in a row without me traveling abroad at least once. Yet, That doesn't make me suddenly be pro-open borders or in favor of transgender extremism. The reason for this is also the fourth and final reason for which this topic matters. People are rarely forever anywheres. Just like other class distinctions, most people bounce from being a somewhere to an anywhere or vice versa at least once. How that affects them depends on other factors such as character, which will eventually be the subject of a separate video. But the fact that the distinction is not rigid is important for practical politics purposes. How? Well, let me explain. So chapter 2, practical politics. Depending on where one is geographically in the campaign, if the political operative meets an anywhere that remembers the time when he was a somewhere, it might indeed help the political operative to remind that anywhere that most of the people are like those that he left behind and invite the said anywhere to think about the impact of his or her ideas on those people before uttering them as absolute pronouncements over how things should be. And you'll say, hold on, but you just said earlier that anywheres deny any form of external authority, to which I will say, yes, I did say that, and I didn't say now that it will be easy. Practical politics is in part a form of art, and persuasion is difficult, but the same ground rules of human nature apply to anywheres as well. The more time the individual spent as an anywhere, the less likely it is that you'll be able to persuade him. So don't waste your time with anywheres aged 50 or above. Those people will never change. 30 years on the drug of expressive individualism can only be reversed by revelation. And I don't mean that in a religious sense necessarily, though that is one acceptable course too. What I mean by revelation is that those people, anywheres aged 50 or above, will only change if something radical happens to them or to someone they know, or simply by accident, like they have an epiphany or something. However, younger anywheres are fair game. The trick is to always frame your agitprop as questions, not only to get more intel about the mindset of the anywhere you're approaching, but also to guide the subject towards his or her origins. You'd be surprised how many things you can get someone to reflect to by asking simple questions. Again, with anywheres, it's not always a winner method. None of this is perfect. So for instance, what I usually do is to try to get as much information as possible about the subject, particularly if his or her parents are still alive. If yes, where do they live? Where did the parents come from? What is their religious background, if any? And things of that nature. This may not be a good tactic in North America, where most of the population is already quite rootless, but it works pretty well in Europe because most people love to talk about their family, even if they only have bad things to say about it. Bitching about your family is still pleasant. So most people will be pretty willing to talk about, but as you politely, carefully, and casually ask your questions, you're not only getting new and presumably better information, you're also guiding the subject into thinking about his or her roots. Now, once that is successful, and again, it's not always successful, but if and when that happens, then you start to ask the subject to think about the topic in the context of his or her parent's hometown. Basically, you pitch the somewheres case, but without explicitly saying, okay, let me tell you how this is seen from the perspective of normal people. Because if you say that, you'll only piss off the subject and the agitprop project collapses with that particular individual. Now, this goes without saying that with this distinction that I just explained in this video in mind, you do tailor your message to the geography of the place you're in. You can't go with the same message in Meissen that you used in Berlin or Frankfurt. But where many political operatives do get it wrong is with the degree of tailoring. Some political operatives work under the assumption that a so-called centrist or moderate tone is preferable, while others work under the assumption that the most extreme version of the message should be used when talking with the somewheres, while the most cucked version should be used when talking with the anywheres. Wrong! And it's wrong because this is not the 1950s anymore. The anywheres of today are quite different in many aspects from the anywheres of the 1950s, and yes, they did exist at that time as well. But the somewheres of today are significantly different than those of the 1950s. For starters, today it's pretty common for the same family to contain both anywheres and somewheres, which was nowhere near that common 70 years ago. In my experience, all that one needs to change is the emphasis and the wording, but not the message itself. Let me give you an example. In the rural areas, I pitch the anti-uncontrolled immigration message as an issue that could wipe out their community in 5 years. Basically, I say, look, you're 5,000 people in this village. Half of you are old, the other half has maybe one child per family. This is not, right now, a direct problem for your community, and if it will be decades down the line, and quite frankly, nobody can predict anything so much time ahead. But if this measure passes, let's say bringing in so-called refugees, or this party gets voted in, 3,000 strangers will march into your community, strangers who have at least 4 children per family. Your community will essentially be wiped out by the next election. And then I'd go into details depending on the circumstances. However, the exact same policy idea, namely opposition to that same arrangement, I pitch it in the cities with an emphasis on safety and taxes, because that's what anywheres tend to care about more, all while appearing to agree. So an example of how I pitch it in would sound like this. Look, obviously your city will not get Islamized. You're 700,000 in the metro area and they will be maybe 10,000. Besides, people from other areas of the country keep on moving here anyway, but given that statistically this group is more violent than the average and less prone to get jobs than the average, who's going to pay for that? Would you be willing to add an extra 1,000 euros a year in your local taxes? Because that's what it will necessarily have to happen. Also, you live in a nice neighborhood. How would you like it for it to suddenly become unsafe for your daughter to walk to school because the new neighbors have their rent subsidized by you and tend to take a dim view of your lifestyle and are willing to physically enforce it? And then, depending on what I had found out in the first place about the interlocutor, then I would start making the narrative pitch as personal as possible for the interlocutor. What I would never do is to engage in theoretical and philosophical discussions. That's a futile endeavor if you're there to push policy. You're not gonna make an anywhere to change his mind on anything deep during an on-the-field agitprop project. But if you make the story personal to him, you do stand a chance to at least get the individual to think about it for a few days. Personal targeted stories, especially those delivered in person, tend to have an impact on people. Not always a profound one, again, this is not exactly an entirely exact science, but an impact for sure. You will, at the very least, plant the seed of doubt if you deliver the personalized narrative right. And that's a no small thing. Most recent anywheres who turned against the far left started with someone planting them the seed of doubt. A good example, for the most recent example that I know, is Chadwick Moore, a New York gay liberal who was the typical anywhere NPC who decided to report fairly on a conversation he had with Milo Yiannopoulos. Fast forward 1 year later, Mr. Moore is a full-on conservative, all because someone planted the seed of doubt and guided him through questions and relatable facts to look a little bit into the leftist bubble, a bit from the outside. That is no small thing. Now, of course, not all stories are like Chadwick Moore's, but to this day, I do get emails from people to whom I pitched ideas years ago in various disagreements and who now thank me for asking them to think. Mind you, most of them did not necessarily end up agreeing with me on many issues, but they did end up internalizing that their own tiny bubble was neither the smartest nor the coolest, and most certainly not so full of wisdom as to go against history and the societal standard just because they feel they know better. That, my fellow deplorables, is again no small thing. But perhaps the most useful practical politics application of the anywhere versus somewhere distinction is to make snap judgments on who to approach and who not to approach, and also to whom it is worth the time to discuss to and whom it doesn't. The most precious resource in practical politics is not necessarily money, but time. You can pull off quite spectacular things with little money, but no amount of money can compensate for lost time in a practical politics scenario. Why? Because you have deadlines, and 10 minutes wasted with a stubborn NPC are 10 minutes you could have spent with a less stuck anywhere with whom those 10 minutes might have made a difference. Learning to recognize the degrees between anywheres and also between somewheres, quite frankly, will pay a lot in terms of time efficiency. You can't persuade everyone, you can't address everyone, and you can't make everyone happy. Nobody can. But you can address more approachable people in the same amount of time if you understand these things and don't waste your time. So yeah, that's why this conflict, anywheres versus somewheres, is relevant from a practical politics perspective, because in democracy, the votes are equal. And if you know your numbers, you can reasonably increase the chances of the non-left to win. Please do keep in mind that this is just one facet of the issue and that this video should be viewed alongside the rest of the practical politics series and not in isolation. All by itself, this piece of knowledge will not bring miracles, but having it gets the non-leftist political operative closer to winning. So yeah, okay, that's it for now. So with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. Please do consider a donation or a pledge should you derive any value from the work being done here. Visit our website, subscribe to my social media, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.